Hello, this is Dan Nowman Niswander, and you are watching the Nowman News Report. Let's try to make sense about what's going on in our world right now. This is a recording in November of 2021, and let's get right into it. First of all, here's a news update on the proposed January 4th, 2022 mandate for most employees to get vaccinations in the United States.
The battle over vaccination. A federal court stepping in to temporarily block the Biden administration's plan to require workers at large businesses to be vaccinated by January 4th. And Janae is here now with more on that. Janae, good morning.
Gio, good morning to you. Yeah, that federal vaccine requirement for 2/3 of the American workforce now on hold. Saturday, a federal appeals court temporarily halting the Biden administration's vaccine mandate for businesses with 100 or more employees, granting an emergency stay of the requirement as businesses were set to face a January 4th deadline to require workers to be fully vaccinated or undergo weekly testing. The Biden administration confident that the requirement and potential $14,000 fine for violations will be upheld by the courts. The requirement that would impact an estimated 17 million healthcare workers prompted weeks of protests. And so far, the COVID-19 pandemic has claimed more than 750,000 lives in the country. The Biden administration pushing extensive vaccinations as the fastest way to end the pandemic.
It actually started with an economic downturn. For more than a year and a half, we have been so-called living with a COVID pandemic. Since March 2020, we have seen lockdowns and business closures, primarily small businesses. Millions of them worldwide are probably gone by now, and they're not coming back. Since March 2020, we have seen censorship and marginalization of effective early treatments for COVID. When people were sick or had tested positive for COVID and had symptoms, we were told by the mainstream, just wait for a vaccine. That was it. Also in March 2020, Congress passed the multi-trillion-dollar CARES Act. Most of it was intended for essential businesses to keep the economy going. It wasn't that transparent, at least at first. We did learn about some of the benefactors over time. It certainly does seem like that most of the benefactors were owners of multi-million and multi-billion-dollar businesses. And that's a story in and of itself. It was the largest wealth transfer in the history of the United States. We saw the Donald Trump administration pass Emergency Use Authorization, or EUA, in December 2020, that, as he put it, rolled out COVID vaccines by the millions at, quote, warp speed, end quote. We have been seeing protests of mandates and vaccination passports all over the world. We have seen protocols change in mask wearing. We saw numerous protocols change due to new data or statistics becoming available, sometimes even weekly or even daily. We have seen millions of people who think hashtag follow the science and collective empathy are exactly the same. And collective empathy is great, but that doesn't automatically mean that you understand science. In other words, it seems like it's become known as, if you don't follow the narrative coming from the multi-billion-dollar bankrolled mainstream media or the regulatory agencies, or the so-called regulatory agencies called the FDA or the CDC, then you are going to get labeled a conspiracy theorist. Speaking of multi-billion-dollar mainstream media, we'll take a quick break and be right back after this.
Is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer. Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. brought to you by Pfizer.
This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
This weather report brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press data download, brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Bill Gates' advice on how to combat mistrust in science at 60minutesovertime.com. Sponsored by Pfizer.
There is a history of the origins of coronaviruses. And also, there is the development of coronavirus vaccines tested on ferrets that were put on pause in 2014. Now, how much of the general public do you really think knows about that, let alone why they were put on pause? I can definitely tell you it wasn't because the scientists figured out what had to be done, so there was no need to proceed with the testing.
Government's been trying for almost 30 years to develop a coronavirus vaccine, and it's been unsuccessful. And beginning in 2002, there were 3 outbreaks of coronavirus, we call them SARS, at that point in MERS. The first SARS was a natural illness that jumped from a bat to human beings. The second 2 were lab created that had escaped and infected human beings. And so the governments of China and a consortium of Western governments all got together and put millions and millions of dollars into an effort to develop a coronavirus vaccine. And between 2002 and 2012, or 2014, they worked very hard to do that. And what happened is they developed about 35 vaccines, and 4 of them were really promising. They chose the 4 most promising, and they gave them to ferrets, which is the animal that is most analogous to human beings when it comes to upper lung respiratory infections. The ferrets had a brilliant, robust, and durable antibody response. But then something horrible happened. And those ferrets were challenged when they were exposed to the wild virus. They got horribly sick. They got inflammation throughout their bodies, and they died. Wow. And the scientists remembered that something very similar had happened in the 1960s, where they had developed a vaccine for RSV, which is very similar to coronavirus. It's an upper respiratory infection ailment. They had skipped the animals and given them directly to 35 children. And the children, again, had developed a very robust antibody response. But when those children were exposed to the wild virus, they got very, very sick, much sicker than unvaccinated children. And 2 of those kids had died. It was a scandal. And they realized when this same thing happened with the ferrets, that there was something that they called enhanced immune response. It's also called pathogenic priming. And what it means is that when you get the vaccine, it appears that you have an antibody response, but when you actually encounter the wild virus, you become much sicker. And it actually creates a pathway that virus hurts you a lot more than with unvaccinated people. So this was 2012.
There are folks who believe that the pandemic was started by communists or socialists, or even China, for instance. There is no proof of this, but it is true that capitalist oligarchs are all over the world, including China and Russia, the European Union, the United States, Australia, Canada, et cetera, and they dominate the economics. If one limits the conversation to just 2 sides on all of this, then it looks to me to be part of some kind of plan to keep the people divided. All the while, no long-term studies exist on any of these vaccines or any of the treatments, such as remdesivir, that has had a horrible record so far. And yet that was included as part of the emergency use authorization, but not ivermectin. And by the way, it went from being horse paste in mainstream commercial media to now being allowed for testing by doctors to use at their discretion, which doctors were using it anyway before the vaccine rollout in December 2020 with some success. There were random studies done, even collected by a couple of researchers, peer-reviewed report of these 20, 30 studies, whatever they were, last year, 2020, submitted to the World Health Organization on the effectiveness of ivermectin as an early treatment and also a prophylaxis, or which is called a prevention. But somehow that was debunked. Ivermectin was called horse paste. And now, of course, you still don't really see it talked about in mainstream media, but apparently the FDA is allowing it to be used by doctors at their discretion for testing in early treatments with COVID patients. It's just crazy. I don't even have the words there. A lot of people don't know about the Nuremberg protocols. Because of the Nuremberg Code, consent for any medical procedure has to be an informed one before consenting to any kind of medical procedure. I mean, that's been accepted globally after the trials that featured Goering, especially his testimony, the Nazi trials. Any consent for any medical procedure has to be informed, and that includes getting a vaccine or an injection. So when it comes to mandating businesses to require vaccine passports for their employees, for instance, or for customers or teachers, students, fire and police departments, the U.S. Armed Forces, or whatever, businesses of 100 employees or more, this is technically unconstitutional. And I think it's important that you know that. And this is a violation directly of the First and the Seventh Amendments of the Constitution, let alone the International Nuremberg Code. There is a lawsuit that has been filed by attorney Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and others representing the firefighters in the Los Angeles area, also representing law enforcement, etc. There will be more. As of the time I'm doing this recording, which is November 2021, and this is only the tip of the iceberg. And I don't want to scare anyone, certainly not, when I talk about what I'm going to be mentioning next. Now, the CDC website does have a zombie preparedness page for marketing purposes. I kid you not. We really do need to have, as Dr. Dan Stock said,
very, very courageous and calm conversations. I don't think a lot of people realize why fear is so effective. But fear limits your ability to get into your memories, and it limits what you can pay attention to. And it limits how people you can reason. That's not just human training, that's human physiology. You have an entire section of your brain which is designed to suppress memories when it has something that thinks very timely. And so we can learn to control that part of our brain, and we can learn to say, hey, look, I understand, but I think you're ginning up the numbers on COVID-19 by changing the diagnosis definition here. And we can get ourselves back to having that conversation. In fact, as people encourage me to have conversations with people, I say, well, you need to go have them as well. But when you do them, ask more questions than you make statements. You have to have people get over that fear so they can sit down. And if they already are in fear and you go after and attack them, you only harden their memory avoidance and their narrow-mindedness. You have to ask them questions and get them to see the part that they're choosing to ignore now without recognizing that they've made that choice. And once we have said, okay, look, it's all on the table, then we're going to get this solved. One of my favorite things I love is somebody says, isn't that a conspiracy theory? Oh. And I always like to come back with an ask and say, well, you do believe Hitler gassed 6 million Jews, right? You believe he dressed prison camp people in Polish uniforms, shot him at the border, photographed him, and told the German people that Poland had attacked him, right? So the difference between a conspiracy theory and a conspiracy is your willingness to sit down and calmly look at all of the data that would prove or disprove the conspiracy theory. And the solution to this is not to, look at all the good data we have on vaccines, most of which comes in the first 3 to 6 months of their use, but to look at the entirety of all of the vaccines through their entire life course. And then we start to see, okay, this isn't so much about the pathogen. This is about the immune system. And that message has been kept from me. And now I want to change the government that kept all of that other information from me.
He's also talking about how COVID is diagnosed. I mean, symptoms are similar, if not the same, with respiratory diseases. I mean, whether you're talking about pneumonia, the flu, RSV, and in some cases, even the common cold. So this is nothing new, and this is science too. Let's look at some terminology like natural immunity or innate immunity. within the body itself, that this is something that has been around in the human body since the beginning of humanity. That hasn't changed, and that's science too. When there is a wild virus that your body gets exposed to, what is the natural response to it, and what's the vaccine response to it? Making the comparison, that's science. And a lot of people may not realize that from the moment the coronavirus is in the system, it begins creating variants. It starts mutating. And so those existed and were out there in the atmosphere, if you will, long before the first vaccines were rolled out. So obviously, it's viruses evolve and they change. Fully vaccinated and pandemic of the unvaccinated. Okay, fully vaccinated means that, I guess in the case of Johnson & Johnson, all you need is one jab. And then, but with the mRNA, with Pfizer or Moderna, you needed two to be fully vaccinated. It's obviously very confusing. And now you need a booster shot.
My brain hurts!
There were no vaccines until December 2020. So pandemic of the unvaccinated was going on already for 8 months. So, and then in Israel, people getting a third shot, a booster shot within a year or so, and with their passports, if you don't have that booster shot by a certain number of months, which I have no idea how they would make that determination, then you're no longer considered vaccinated or fully vaccinated. And you may not be able to get into schools or public places, businesses. Well, it's obviously very confusing. I understand. It's very clear to me why the passports and the mandates are very confusing and why people are resisting. And I do have to bring up the VAERS, the acronym VAERS. And what that stands for is Vaccine Adverse Effects Reporting System. Now, here in the US, I know that there is the VAERS on the CDC Wonder page. Yeah, that's right, Wonder. And there's another one called openvaers.com. The World Health Organization uses a site called VIGI Access, access.org. And in the UK, they have what is called the yellow card. And those are just some of what I know. And that is information that you can look at if you're interested. You might be surprised what you find there. Do you notice how people will still say that I'm protecting myself and others by getting a vaccine? Well, the CDC website, it doesn't even say anything like that. It basically says that even if you're fully vaccinated, you can still get the virus and you can still transmit it to somebody else. So where people are getting this idea that they're protecting other people and they're protecting themselves, I don't get it. It has short-term benefits for yourself, essentially because of the antibody responses, and they're robust at first, but they diminish in a matter of months. We don't know what would happen at this point, let's say, until you're exposed to new wild viruses. That looks to me to be more of the reality of what's going on in real time. And of course, I'm saying this in November of 2021. So breakthrough cases is another term that means you can be fully vaccinated and still get the virus and transmit it to other people. So why do people not seem to want to talk about that? The mainstream media certainly doesn't talk about that either.
My brain hurts!
First of all, I do want to say that I am not even attempting to give any medical advice. I just want that to be clear. And I want to analyze the segment from the major television network station at the beginning of this episode. And it's awful that there's nearly 800,000 COVID deaths in the United States so far. But I do have to ask the question, first of all, are all of those 800,000 deaths really because of COVID? A lot of people do have comorbidities, pre-existing conditions, etc. How do we know that it wasn't one of those that was the cause of death? I talked to a male nurse actually that told me in 2020 that he knew a baby was stillborn, yet on the death certificate, the hospital put COVID-19. So that was happening. And to what extent was that kind of thing happening? Good question. I know there's people that have done a lot of thoughtful research on their own to decide how to go forward from here, as far as getting booster shots or making decisions for family members. And I appreciate that. People should do their own research based on phase 1 and phase 2 of the coronavirus vaccine trials. First of all, it is easy to say that a lot of the funding coming for those trials come from the manufacturers of the products themselves. This is no secret. We've seen that more and more as the decades have passed. There's not as much public funding for these kinds of things as there used to be. Number 2, they use placebos. They'll have the coronavirus vaccine, and then they'll have a vaccine with something else in it. Is it just saline solution? Or could the ingredients be something that might be even more toxic than anything that could possibly be in the COVID-19 vaccine? Number 3, before the vaccines rolled out, there were reports showing that 80% of the COVID-19 symptoms were mild to none. After there was some vaccine rollout, the reports were 85% reduction in the severity of the symptoms from COVID. What does that mean? Number 4, always in these trials, there's comparison of statistics, comparing benefits with risks. We already know that the initial responses of the antibodies are robust after vaccination, and it wanes within months. So there is the temporary and the marginal benefits there that we know of. And as far as the risks go, there are, as I mentioned, the vaccine adverse effects reporting systems. And how can they be compared to really give more clear understanding of those comparisons? And number 5, as far as the benefit side of it, do they include the smaller peer-reviewed studies that aren't billionaire funded, that are done by organizations such as the FLCCC.net, Frontline COVID-19 Critical Care Alliance of Doctors around the world, or Dr. Zelenko, both that came up with early treatment protocols using cocktails of ingredients that included ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, quercetin, zinc, vitamin D3, vitamin C, selenium, etc. Were those factored into the benefits side? I talked to people that didn't even know who those people or organizations were, even though one of the doctors of the FLCCC actually spoke in front of Congress. Number 6, is there really adequate follow-up on those adverse effects reporting systems data? Number 7, after mass vaccination, there was a claim that there was a major drop in the rate of infections. We also know, again, from natural immunity, that there were tens of millions of people that had recovered from COVID. Is that data factored into that? Also, in the summertime, there is more sunshine, and that is D3 right there, one of the vitamins that would be considered antiviral. And certainly testing is going to be lower and cases reported are going to be lower in the summertime in ordinary circumstances. Does that factor in? Number 8, pandemics tend to last 1 to 1.5 years. Is that a factor in fewer cases reported or fewer tests given? Number 9, after patients were vaccinated, hospitals stopped testing those patients. Is that going to factor in the number of cases of COVID reported? And finally, number 10, the PCR test itself. How effective is it really? It goes all the way back to the HIV/AIDS era, and even its creator, Kelly Mullins, has this to say.
And HIV is like that. Those tests are all based on things that are invisible, and the results are inferred in a sense. PCR is separate from that. It's just a process that's used to make a whole lot of something out of something. That's what
also,
it is. But it's not. It doesn't tell you that you're sick, and it doesn't tell you that the thing you ended up with really was going to hurt you or anything like that. That's what it's not.
So even if you believe in HIV, it can't tell the difference between virus particles or active live virus. I mean, there's a lot of questions.
There is a new book being released by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on November 19th, 2021. And for those of you who may not know who he is, he's an American radio host, attorney, and activist, co-founder of the nonprofit environmental group Waterkeeper Alliance, as well as Children's Health Defense. That's a big focus of his work right now at this point of time in history. And he's also the son of Robert F. Kennedy Sr. and the nephew of former President John F. Kennedy. And the name of the book is The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. As I mentioned, it is scheduled to be released November 19th, 2021. And there's a lot of information in there, and hopefully he will be able to answer at least some of your questions. I'm sure you will have many. These are very interesting, unusual times, and I think it's important for us to be well equipped to know how to go forward together and solve some problems here and create the kind of world that we really want to create.
And everybody's out here. It isn't just one point of view, but we're all together.
Pandemic is over if you want it.
I totally agree. That's right. Thank you.
Pastor Martin Niemöller in 1936, in talking about the Nazi takeover of Germany where he lived. Here's a quote. "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists.
And I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Wake up and join the fight. Don't sit, don't be lazy, don't be complacent. It's now or we're in trouble. Like, now is the time for everybody to join together. And the last thing is this. It doesn't matter what your religion is. It doesn't matter what side you think you are on related to your political affiliation. It doesn't matter even if you've gotten the COVID shot or not, whether you're vaccinated or not vaccinated. It doesn't matter your religion. None of those things matter right now. What is happening is greater and bigger than anything we've ever faced in human history, my friends. This is global. It's not just California. It's global. And what is happening across the whole entire world is something we haven't seen before. And so right now, we need the greatest warriors that have ever existed in human history to stand up with so much courage that you aren't willing to back down in the face of fear. You're not willing, you're willing to put your job on the line. You're willing to put everything on the line so that this doesn't go any farther than it already has. So thank you so much. I'm so thankful to be here with you all. Please stand with us and make sure that you sign at least our petition right here.